Dr. Pullan is going to be talking about architecture and urban conflict and how they connect. And I'm reminded at the UIA Congress, which was held in August 2014, which was the last one, that Justin Udin stood up, and the first words of that conference, which was held in Cape Town, we have to understand the context, is that architecture is politics. And I think architects forget that at their peril, and I'm really very interested in hearing what Dr. Pullan has to say. It's wonderful to see such a mix of students and practitioners here, and this lecture tonight has been organised in collaboration with the Department of Architecture at Cambridge, and I hope that there will be many future collaborations ahead. The RIBA, many council members fought very hard for students to get free membership of the RIBA, and I always say the best things in life are free. So if you're not a member, please pick up a form upstairs on the desk and join up. There are lots of wonderful lectures that are given at headquarters. The building, of course, is very spectacular itself. I think yesterday or the day before, Sugar Van just gave a talk, and it's well worth heading out to Cambridge and hitting the city lights and exploring not only the RIBA but the area around there. Dr. Wendy Pullan is head of the Department of Architecture at the University of Cambridge. She was principal investigator for conflict in cities and the contested state, an international and multidisciplinary research project based in the UK and funded by the ESRSC Large Grants Programme. She's now the director for the Centre for Urban Conflicts Research. She received the Royal Institute of British Architects inaugural President's Award for university-led research for her work on conflict in cities. Dr. Pullan's recent publications include Locating Urban Conflicts, co-edited in 2013. I'm in the last century still. And The Struggle for Jerusalem's Holy Places, which was co-authored in 2013 as well. She's a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. Wendy,
thank you very much. I'm going to go to that side, I think. Get my pointer.
Okay, thank you very much, Yasmin. I will say that by bringing architecture and politics together, you probably stole the most important thing I have to say tonight, but all I can say is yes, architecture is a political act, and this is one of the things that I really do want to talk about tonight, that there is quite a profound connection. It's an honor to give the RIBA East Spring Lecture, and I'd like to thank the organizers very much for putting together this event. And I'm also delighted that we have an event like this, and as I say, hopefully, that will bring together the Department of Architecture and the RIBA. Now, tonight, I want to talk about something that I think is symbolized in this particular image right here. Now, the process where we go, presumably, from destruction to reconstruction is not a simple one. It is much more complex than most people realize. And it's not usually predictable, and it's not necessarily linear. And this is despite the best efforts of architects' skills, architects' good intentions, architects' visions, and it even goes beyond the powers of governmental authorities and international authorities, various groups who push hard for reconstruction. At this point, I would say that reconstruction of buildings and whole cities that have suffered excessive levels of conflict probably depend more on the nature of that conflict than any other factor that is part of what will happen to those cities. And of course, we're seeing this happen more and more. I mean, you turn on the news at night, you look at your computers, and what you find, of course, is that there are more and more cities that are suffering excessive levels of conflict. And so that this sort of picture that we're looking at right here with the damaged facade has become, unfortunately, very, very familiar to us. Now, what I'm interested in this particular lecture is actually not so much this building or this building, but I'm interested in the seam in between the two of them. Now, that may not sound terribly promising as a lecture, so I think I better explain to you exactly why I'm interested in that. So I've taken away my little title here so that you can see the picture better. I think what we're looking at here, most superficially, is a fairly straightforward case of a building that has been repaired and another building that's very similar to it that hasn't been repaired. This is the city of Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The photograph was taken nearly 20 years after the Dayton Agreement, which was the peace agreement that was made in that city that ended the fighting. Now, the architectural repair, yes, is important, but there's also this issue of symbolic repair. And for me, these two buildings symbolize a city of conflict and what I would call a viable city. I'm not pushing it that hard, maybe not a good city, but at least a viable city. And so that if we look at the city of conflict, yes, we see the very damaged facade full of bullet holes. A lot of people have evacuated the place. Interesting, though, to see that somebody has returned here, and they have renovated their own flat within that, but the building is basically vacant, and there are these gaping holes inside the building. Now, if we look next to it, and we see this is the building that is clean, it's fresh, it's been very, very recently reconstructed, and people have moved back in again. Symbolic, then, of the way we would wish to live in the cities. But I think one of the things that's very interesting about it is if you go to Mostar, you find a whole street that looks like this. About half of the buildings are damaged and about half not. And in fact, the whole city is like that as well. And so what we're seeing here is a peace agreement, all of the political negotiations that took place, but there's still no viable city. The city is so badly damaged that it simply hasn't recovered from that. And nobody is quite sure how to put that together again. As Yasmin said, this is, the research comes out of a large grant that I had and remains part of the Center for Urban Conflicts Research. This is based in the Department of Architecture. I think it's just good for you to know where I'm getting my ideas and so on. This has been a research project that has been going on for over 10 years. I'm not going to say more about that tonight, but that's basically the background of it. Now, I think another influence on my planning of this lecture has been the RIBA exhibition that is now on in London, and it is called Creation from Catastrophe. Now, this is a very interesting exhibition in that it portrays in a lot of ways an architectural dream. The premise of the exhibition is that if there is terrible disaster and almost complete destruction of a city, that it makes a clean slate, it makes an open palette for architects then to come up with visionary ideas. And in a lot of ways we can say, yeah, I mean, that is the architectural dream. How wonderful to be able to to respond to something that gives you absolute freedom. And so it's a very interesting exhibition. If you haven't seen it, I think well worth looking at. But I have to say, I also have to question that premise. You know, to what extent really is there ever a clean slate, even if the city has been completely destroyed? There are many vested interests, and they come in and they start to mark up the clean slate. The RIBA exhibition makes clear that there is a difference between human destruction and natural destruction or natural disasters, and for the most part that exhibition focuses on natural disasters. And what I will say, in my experience, I think it is probably easier to deal with the destruction of a natural disaster than it is to deal with cities that have been subject to human destruction and human wars. And this is one of the problems that we face. The really worrying thing about it, of course, is that we may be facing both natural disasters and human disasters. With climate change, you get a lot of flooding, for example, and that can bring on conflict within a city. So it's not a particularly happy picture for us to look at or think about. Now, I want to start here with two examples. One is the Lisbon earthquake, and this is one of the examples that's used in the RIBA exhibition. The Lisbon earthquake was a terrible earthquake from the middle of the 18th century. And interestingly, though, it has been seen as the event that begins modernity or heralds modernity. It's been seen as a transformational event in modern culture. The obvious questions that would have been asked at the time: is it an act of God or some sort of scientific phenomenon? I mean, you can imagine what kind of discussions went on. Certainly, there is the question here that begins in the 18th century. It was asked before that, but it comes to a head with this. To what extent are humans in control of their own destiny? And from Voltaire to Adorno, there has been commentary about this particular event. We still talk about it today as something that is absolutely formulative. And if you look at the response to it, it's very interesting. The Prime Minister, the Marquess de Pombal, had a very sort of practical attitude towards it. He said, bury the dead and heal the living. And he got on with plans to rebuild the city. The king decided, out of 4 plans, the king decided to take the most radical plan, that you come in and get rid of all the rubble and you rebuild completely in a different form. And this rather famous Grand Place, the open square right on the harbor front in Lisbon today, was the result of that. And if you look at it, you see it's very, very rationally planned, very typical of the 18th century, and there is the sense of very, very strong control in the planning right here. Now, Pombal, the Marquess de Pombal, was the one who instigated and developed the planning. In fact, I mean, these are called the Pombolino buildings. And I think it's interesting to look at how he is pictured right here. It's a rather famous painting. It's been repeated many, many times, copied. There's an engraving in the RIBA exhibition that shows him in the same pose here. And there he is sitting there looking out at his harbor, and what he's got are all of his architectural plans right there. And basically, he's inviting us to not just see what he's done, but get a sense of the level of control that he has over this particular project. So, I mean, in a sense, here we have the clean slate and this desire to control the environment. And I would say, I mean, various interesting things developed out of this. It was the beginning of seismology in architecture, and we start to get the interest in making earthquake-proof buildings, and so that there started to be a real investigation into how we control our environment. The bottom line of this is that I think what we're looking at here is the belief that we can form our cities moving from chaos to order, that the direction that we go in goes from chaos to order. And in a lot of ways, I think that really is the basis of modern architectural thinking and practice. Now, I want to compare it with my second example, and that is Aleppo. And we all know Aleppo at this point, I think, because of the war in Syria. If we look at Aleppo, this photograph was taken in 2011. This was just before the war started. And what we see here is a large city and an intact city. For those of you who aren't particularly familiar with what Aleppo was, this was one of the finest medieval cities in the Middle East. It grew to be the largest city in Syria. Many historical and religious monuments. A very, very important city. It became a World Heritage Site in 1986, and it was restored with completion in 2006. And then it became the Islamic capital of culture in that same year. Now that is typical of Aleppo today, where huge swaths of the city are completely gone, completely destroyed. And so I think one of the things that we have to ask here then is, well, what are the chances for Aleppo in the future? A city that was completely restored by 2006 and by 2015 looks like this. Will a restoration like that ever happen again? And if so, what could it possibly be? The idea that there would be the money and even the will and peace with enough longevity and goodwill between all of the fighting parties, it's hard to believe at this point, and we'll have to see what happens. But certainly what we seem to be looking at here is that we're going from order to chaos rather than the other direction. And I think one of the questions that we probably have to ask with images like this is whether Aleppo as a city will mark a transformation in how we view urban areas. We don't know. I mean, this is something that I'm only guessing at this point, and we'll have to see in the future what does happen with that. But one thing that we do know is that conflict has changed and cities have changed. That the new conflicts that we're looking at today represent all sorts of different tensions. They can be within the state, they can be between different states. Very often now we're finding that they have to do with transnational situations. They have to do with the moving of people, non-state individuals and groups. So migrants and minorities and regional ethnicities all play a role in this. Conflicts have become much more complex. They tend to be long-term and even indeterminate. We don't know when really they began. Very often we certainly don't know when they will end. We get periods of heavy violence, and then certainly in a lot of the cities that I study, we get periods of relative peace where people can get on with their lives and so on. But violence can flare up again quite easily, and we often don't know when that will happen. So really the idea then of post-conflict becomes questionable, I would say, in a situation like this. We use the term a lot. I must say I personally don't, because I think it's simply too difficult, because we don't really know what a post-conflict period is in most of these places. But as a concept, it's questionable. Now, the other thing, as I said, cities are changing, because one of the things that we're finding is that the wars that are fought out by civilians and not by armies, without beginnings and without ends, are fought out in cities today. The main place where the conflicts are played out are inside cities. You know, this is no longer a situation of armies fighting each other so much. They tend to be paramilitary groups and civilian groups. There's I think, a rather interesting little quote here from the mayor of Philadelphia, and this is something that he said after the urban riots in the 1960s in the US, so quite a long time ago, and I think it was a really prescient statement. He says, "From now on, a state's borders run inside its cities." And if you think of those of us who are old enough to remember the 1960s, you think back at that point, the idea that a state's borders would run inside cities is a very odd and unusual idea. Today, it's something that is really quite acceptable. And so that what we're finding, like this in this picture of Berlin here, which of course suffered both types of war, the more standard war fought with armies and very, very much a variety of civilian conflicts. What we find then are that these cities are the primary locus for ethno-national and religious conflicts and also class divisions within them. But what I will say, and in a lot of ways the most important thing, is that cities are also the locus for cultural diversity. Cities naturally have borders in the middle of them because historically this is where people came together. And without diversity, you do not have a city. It will be something else. It might be a village, it might be a tribe, but it's not a city. A city must have diversity. And so, by nature then, the city will have conflict. All right, so what matters then in urban conflict? And why should architecture be involved here? I've come up with 5 areas here, and each one of them is very physical and I think does have to do with architecture and planning. And I want to just go through these rather quickly and give you some sense of examples of how architecture has been involved. First of all, we can talk about what I would call the new walled cities. We have old walled cities. It was typical of historical cities to have walls around them. And the wall around an old city usually meant that the city had a certain amount of unity, that it was big enough to have a certain amount of clout, and if you lived within that wall, it meant that you were a citizen, which was usually quite an important thing. So quite a variety of rich meanings in an old walled city. A new walled city at this point seems to mark only the line of conflict. We get examples like in Nicosia, like in Jerusalem, and like in Belfast, where security is being taken to extreme ends. I think that the walls are becoming hallmarks of contested space. That they tend to be very, very iconic, and they're seen in terms of differences that are simply irreconcilable. But I think the walls are also acts of despair. And you can understand what happens when battles are going on and people are killing each other. The municipal authorities need to do something to stop that. And the knee-jerk reaction is to pull the populations apart from each other. And how do they do that? They put in a wall or a buffer zone or some sort of dividing line. So it is very much a knee-jerk reaction, but it comes out of despair. And one of the great problems with it, of course, is that these are meant to be temporary divisions, and we all know how often the temporary continues and becomes very, very permanent. And with that, heavy spatial inconsistencies inside the city by opposing these sorts of physical borders. And I think what's interesting, certainly for me as an architect, that these are not simply territorial borders. they are very spatial. If you look at these maps that we drew and meant as a comparison of dividing lines in cities, and the red line in each of these does mark a dividing line. And what we see is that these cities vary tremendously one from the next. I mean, from the divided city of Nicosia, and that's an international border going right through the center of the city, to the island that was West Berlin, to the absolutely crazy wall that goes in and out and around Jerusalem right there, to Belfast, where you can just probably barely see the little red squiggles in there. Each one of those is a wall in a neighborhood in Belfast. All of that is spatial. It has spatial ramifications inside the city. It doesn't simply divide and exclude in a territorial way, that it will affect the spatial functioning and understanding of the city. I mean, I think these here are probably a little bit more complicated. This one is particularly interesting of Kirkuk. If you can see the dotted lines here, these are the different quarters of Kirkuk, but when they actually surveyed the different ethnic groups, that we see that they don't really correspond anymore to those lines of the quarters. And then when we finally get to Brussels, and you probably never thought of Brussels as a divided city, but of course it is in a variety of ways with the two different languages. And all of my colleagues in Brussels say you cannot map Brussels. And so we have this situation here of a city that is actually very mixed in the center, but as soon as you get into the suburbs, they become ethnically identifiable. So spatial, not simply territorial. Infrastructures and mobilities follow along this problem of the walls and the spatial inconsistencies that you get, but of course infrastructures, particularly large road systems, often work in slightly different ways. Roads don't just divide, but they also connect. And we see, for example, in Beirut, major motorway that is virtually impossible to cross, and I'm sure all of us know, and many of us have been involved in actually working with large road systems like this in inner cities, but this happens to go between a Sunni and a Shia neighborhood. And what happens is that roads are being put in, they're being used like walls. They're being used to divide communities. And I think, again, I probably don't have to elaborate very much when I say there is nothing that divides a city and lasts as long as a wide road with fast traffic going along it. And if you think of the longevity of Roman roads, those alignments are there pretty much forever. But sometimes it's more complicated than that. And we'll go back to Mostar here. And Mostar is very interesting. If you remember the Civil War there, you may remember this bridge that was blown up and repaired very quickly after the war. The international community was horrified by the destruction of the bridge, and once the war ended, got together the money to rebuild the bridge. It was done very quickly, and everybody thought, oh, wonderful, the bridge will be symbolic, it'll bring the Bosniaks and the Croats back together again. All right, that's fine as an idea. However, what they didn't bother doing was looking at the city, that it's not the river that divides the city. The Croat side is here in this kind of ochre color, and the Bosniak side is here in this gray color. The city is not divided by the river, and the bridge is here. The city is actually divided by a road, which is right there. That's called the boulevard. And that is right here in this photograph, and we see that nobody's bothered to reconstruct that particular road system. It's not as wide or as difficult as the road in Beirut, but to this day it remains the main division in this city, and it works against any sort of physical reunification in the city itself. So a lot of lessons to be learned in that particular case. All right, moving on to the next point, planning. Jerusalem is a fantastic laboratory to see how planning has been used to exacerbate conflict. And this has been going on now actually for decades, and it's reached quite a great height. And a lot of that has to do with the Israeli settlement program. I have two examples here of the settlements that are made for Jewish-only residents. They tend to be placed on hilltops, looking down on the Palestinian areas, which we see off in the distance right there. And these are big. I mean, these are not a few caravans on a hilltop anymore. I mean, what we're looking at are small towns. They have populations, some of them of 40,000 people. And interesting, I think, to compare the architecture. This one that was built in the 1970s, and I can remember looking at it and talking with people, and there was a lot of the discussion was, is it meant to look like a fortress? And nobody was really sure. By the time we get to this one, which was built in 2005, or completed in 2005, by this point we were rather sure that it was meant to look like a fortress on a hilltop. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary structure up there, looking down actually at Bethlehem in that particular direction. Now, to look at Jerusalem in map form gives us further idea of how all of this was accomplished. That we have a map here of the division of Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967. That was the green line. This was Israel. At that time, this was Jordan. The yellow areas here are areas of Palestinian habitation, and the hatched areas there are Israeli habitation. So in 1967, with the war, Israel conquers East Jerusalem, and very, very quickly, in fact, within 10 days after the war, annexes East Jerusalem and makes a new municipal border, which is this dotted line over there. So all of a sudden, the city enlarges tremendously. Then the settlement program begins, and all of these blue splotches then are the various settlements built only on Palestinian land. And they are built to surround the city as a type of protection. But more than that, you can see how interspersed they are with the yellow areas that are Palestinian. And they are built in a way that they are, the blue settlements are relatively contiguous spatially, but they are interspersed with the Palestinian areas, and that prevents the Palestinian villages and suburbs from expanding horizontally. The only way they can go is up. Then we get the period of the wall. And the wall, as I said, I mean, it has an absolutely crazy route, and the reason the route is so crazy is that they're trying to cut out as many Palestinians as possible and enclose as many settlement areas as possible. And so we get this juddering wall back and forth through the whole thing, and these X's are checkpoints, at which point you can cross through if you happen to have the right identification papers. But finally, I'd say the pièce de résistance in this particular plan is not the wall, but it is the road system. What we're looking at is a segregated road system, that these very fine black lines are old roads, and they're used by the Palestinians. And the red lines, and you can see how they connect the settlements, these are bypass roads, and they are used by the settlers in order to move around quite quickly. It's a completely segregated system, and it, in a way, fills out the bottom of the iceberg. If the tip of the iceberg is simply the wall that everybody has been very excited about and really has galvanized international opinion, and that's how we understand Jerusalem today, is by that wall. And the middle of the iceberg then is actually the settlements. And of course, the wall can come down. The settlements are not going to be moved. I mean, there's a lot of them, and they are heavily populated. And then finally, this road system, which really will be there pretty much forever. And that's the bottom of the iceberg that nobody ever bothers looking at all. And of course, this has all been a planning activity. Many, many architects involved in it, working very, very closely with the planners, and the whole thing actually directed by the politicians. Now, the topic of what I call frontier urbanism, is what do we get when we have this sort of planning? What does the city end up looking like? Well, I use the term frontier urbanism because I think it describes a particular situation that we find in a number of different cities that have had excessive conflict. And I think probably it's something that is becoming more common in cities that don't even have such high levels of conflict. I would say that frontier urbanism can be defined as that, first of all, it's the civilians that form radicalized frontiers. It's not armies, it's not even paramilitaries in most cases, it's civilian groups. And the other thing is that urban spaces and structures may be used to orient the city to the radicalized frontier and may be used to encourage confrontation, right? So that the architecture goes together with the use of the civilian groups, and that exacerbates the conflict. And so that we get situations like this in the middle of Belfast, where it's very, very clear what sort of territory you're in as long as you can read the paintings on the wall. And that, of course, relates back to all of these little red squiggles that I showed you on the map earlier. And I would say that is certainly a case of frontier urbanism in the middle of the city. Another example here, back to Jerusalem. Here's the wall running between two areas, two residential areas. This is an Israeli settlement over here, and on that side is a Palestinian. Well, it was a village turned suburb turned virtual town at this point. Again, you can see how they've built upward. And one of the great problems with this is what we have are Israelis sitting here staring across the valley, and that's not such a long distance, and Palestinians over here staring back across the valley. And these two groups of people stare at each other. I mean, you can't help but do that because that's how the topography works, and that's how the architecture has been planned. So that there is this persistent gaze. However, there's no access because there's a segregated road system. And so they don't connect. There's no physical connection. And so you sit there and you think, here I am with my people on my side of the border, and who are they on the other side? And there is the vilification of people on the far side of the border. You look at them, you wonder, what are they doing? What are they doing to hurt me and my people? And that's a real problem. And so you see how civilians get drawn into these narratives, really, of frontier urbanism. If we go back to Nicosia, we find in Nicosia, this is the old city wall, and it has been divided like that for the past 42 years. And the buffer zone, which the Nicosians call the dead zone, looks like that at its best. I mean, that was a very lovely spring day, but you can see it's just sort of overgrown and nothing much there except a UN tower. And most of it looks more like that. I mean, it's pretty beat up and ramshackle at this point. Nobody lives in the buffer zone. The buffer zone is just a vacant area in the city. But the really unfortunate thing about it is that that area of the city was the main commercial strip in the city. This is where the markets were and the shops were. We did a project interviewing a lot of the now elderly shopkeepers who had shops in this area, and they were the ones who were bilingual, because this is where people mixed. This is where they came together in the city, and so people spoke Turkish and Greek. Now most people don't speak Turkish and Greek anymore. They only speak one or the other. And so what's happened with this division here is that we get a situation where the most alive part of the city became the most dead part of the city. And we know how difficult it is that once you have a situation like that for many, many years, how difficult is that to put the city back together again? I mean, what in the world do you design in here? And it's not a park, because a park remains overly quiet. Park is probably the easiest alternative, and it has been proposed, but I don't think it'll work. I mean, there's really the question of how do you begin to reconstruct the most important and most dynamic part of the city. That's a difficult problem. And finally, then my last point has to do with shared space. And I'm sorry, I realize the lecture is a kind of a grim lecture. Yeah, okay. But I think there's, when people ask me, well, all right, what can we do really? All right, I think there's one thing that's come out in all of our research that is very, very important in terms of what can we do? And that has to do with public space. What we've found is that people, when there is relative peace in these cities, people gravitate back into public spaces. And there is a certain amount of mixing there. Now, it's not that they all of a sudden rush into the public space and greet each other. No, they don't. They don't like each other and they distrust each other. However, I think it's important that each person sees a face that doesn't look like theirs. It's important to hear the language of the other. In some places, this is in Jerusalem, and this is one of my favorite photographs I've ever taken, because what we've got here are Palestinians. We even have a disabled Palestinian. We have a Coptic monk. We have tourists. We have Israeli border police and Israeli army over here. All right, that is mixed. Now, by standards here, everybody looks kind of unhappy, and they're certainly not socializing with each other. But coming back to the problem of vilifying the other when you don't see them, public places become a way of at least people encountering others, and that is rather important. Now, the first thing that goes in times of heavy conflict is public space. It's not secure enough, it's too hard to control, and that's what gets closed down very, very quickly in times of heavy conflict. And one of the big questions is then how do we bring public space back again in a lot of these cities? But I think that's where, really the hope is. It's in the possibility of shared space, even if we start in a very, very minimal sort of way. So, to conclude then, and in a way I conclude simply with questions about what architects do. And what our role might be in all of this. And that's the first question is, can architecture play a positive role in urban conflict situations? We haven't found many examples of actual buildings or complexes really helping very much. In fact, it's often the contrary, that buildings that are put in very often make the situation worse. And that's a whole other story that I'm not going to go into at this point. But I think it is worth at least making my list here to think about, well, what can architecture do? All right, so first of all, architecture may be used by oppressive powers. I mean, we've just seen examples of that, so that's not very good. Architects may like being used by oppressive powers. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in a lot of these cases, and that's something that certainly there are many architects who are quite happy to forget about the politics and instead build in difficult areas. Some architects believe that their role is not political. I hope I've been able to show you this evening why architecture is a political act. I've taken extreme examples here in order to show you, but I think we could also look at much less extreme examples and still see that architecture is political. Some architects are simply ignorant of political and social situations. I hope that's changing. I mean, certainly in our department, one of the things that we're trying to do with the students and with our research teams is to better understand why social and political issues are very, very important as part of the design process. But finally, the last point right here, which is, can architecture orient towards conflict? And I think as we see more and more cities falling into situations of bad conflict, I think we have to ask that particular question. To what extent can we? Now here we come back to the problem of the clean slate. You know, how nice it is to design without constraints. How nice it is to look at our designs only in a very, very positive way, that what we will do can only make things better. I think we have to question that. I think we have to come back and understand what is going on in cities and are we making things better? What can we do? You know, at what points do we need to simply use restraint rather than pitch right in and design very quickly without understanding the wider ramifications, often social, political, economic, which I haven't talked about a lot tonight, but obviously that's another factor that sits within this whole cocktail that we must understand if we're going to be able to work successfully with these particular problems. Thank you very much.